Hello, and welcome to Brown Bag History, Women's Rights Beyond the 19th Amendment. Staff are monitoring our social media chats, so you're welcome to ask any questions at any time in the chat, and staff will archive and aggregate those for the Q&A. A recording will be available on the Minnesota Historical Society Facebook page and our YouTube channel shortly after the program ends. Now, I want to acknowledge that even though this is a virtual event, the Minnesota Historical Society is located on the traditional territory of many nations and on the homeland of the ancestral lands of the Dakota people, who still continue to call this region home. Now, we want to pay our respects to the Indigenous ancestors of this place. And as we begin today's program, please consider the legacies of Dakota, Ojibwe, and other Indigenous nations who are working to have their histories included in school textbooks and the national narrative. Now I'm going to introduce our panel and then dive into our conversation. We are scholars, women, and museum professionals who work together at the Minnesota Historical Society. I am Sandra Ryerson. I'm a curator of 3D objects. I occasionally appear on the Society's social media channels in pieces about the collection, but my primary role is to shape and share the artifact collection. I also provide access to the collection through tours and exhibits, which have brought me into contact with our speakers. So with me today, we have Ami Naff, an exhibits researcher at the Minnesota Historical Society. She helps identify and interpret the questions, stories, and material culture that make MNHS exhibits come to life for visitors. And Jessica Ellison, who is a teacher educator who has supported K-12 social studies education with workshops and curriculum for 15 years. Jessica serves as president of the Minnesota Council for the Social Studies. She serves on her local school board and is raising 4 children with her husband. So we are going to discuss the challenges we face when marking an anniversary that presents a narrow lens on a much larger historical movement. 100 years ago today, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment, thus passing the 3/4 threshold required for the amendment to become law. But the story of women advocating for their right to vote and participate in civic life was in motion long before and after 1920. In fact, the movement started long before the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 and isn't over yet. So over the past year, Ami Naff, Jessica Ellison, and others around the nation have been researching and developing exhibits and programs to honor this anniversary while expanding the narrative beyond the few women whose names many of us recognize. You know, anniversaries remind us of something that matters to us, but it's important to re-examine why it matters. So bring us into your process. How did you work through the complexity of telling a fuller story about women and their place in civic life? And what was unique about your role in this work? I'm going to start with you, Ami.
Thank you, Sandra. We started in the exhibits team with our partnership with the League of Women Voters Minnesota, and we wanted to work together to commemorate and honor the women who had fought for the right to vote up to the 19th Amendment and beyond. We wanted to take this long view of the history, recognizing that it started way before 1848, before Seneca Falls, and it's continuing today. And we wanted to tell it through the stories of individual women. And as you're saying, it's super complex. It's as complex as those women. So we wanted to make it a very human story and show how personal this was to each person.
We have a lot of similarities in how we handled this in teacher education as how Ami and others handled it in exhibits. It's really about helping teachers teach their students that this movement was a mile wide and a mile deep, that women have been fighting for their rights and advocating for themselves for a long time, that women are multifaceted, dynamic people, individuals, and that this movement is really complicated. We also wanted to help our teachers see how local this movement was, that it wasn't just something that was happening in Washington, D.C. It was something that was happening all over the country and in every pocket of Minnesota. Because if students can see that it was happening in their community, it makes it more relevant for them.
Yeah, you talk about the complexities of women, that makes me think about the themes that emerge that kind of connect women across all those variations. So, can you speak to what themes emerged in your conversations around developing the project? Most folks know the names of women like Susan B. Anthony and Alice Paul, and if you don't, Google. So how did you move toward expanding that narrative beyond those names we know?
So this is sort of an exceptional person narrative, oftentimes, that we only talk about particular individuals like Susan B. Anthony and Alice Paul. And in my mind, I sort of visualized it as a series of cotton balls placed along a timeline. And what I wanted to do for teachers is kind of stretch those cotton balls so that they could see how all of these things took place over a long period of time and dive into the stories that aren't as often told as part of the traditional narrative and don't appear in textbooks, in particular women of color who were doing this work for just as long and working just as hard, but don't often get included in this narrative. And that women were involved at every level for decades. And so we really tried to highlight, again, like Ami said, the humanity of it, the humanness of this story, and that women of all backgrounds have been involved from the beginning.
Well, Jessica, you mentioned, women of color being left out of the narrative, and I think suffrage is far from the only topic where that's true. Do you have thoughts on, how and why that has happened?
I think that the stories of history often were written by white people and people in power, and the movement itself had a lot of racist elements. The movement was focused on for a long time as this sort of middle class white movement, and we see people like Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Alice Paul fitting that narrative. And in order to get the amendment passed, there were a lot of suffragettes who compromised and excluded their sisters of color, but it doesn't mean that they weren't there doing the work. And so I think it's really exciting that the work that we're doing in teacher education and the work that Ami and others are doing are pulling up these incredible stories of women of color who are fighting not just for suffrage, but for many other rights as well.
I want to just sort of build on what you're saying, Jessica. And one of the really interesting themes that we were building or kind of discussing and developing the exhibit is how do women build these coalitions, because they have this shared goal of passing the 19th Amendment, or beyond the 19th Amendment, of securing the right to vote, because just because it was affirmed then doesn't mean that it's secured. So they're working together trying to build these coalitions, and as you're saying, sometimes making compromises, and some people are refusing to work, but we see these patterns of negotiating and strategizing, and I think that sort of that's the kind of thing that we start to see repeating again today, and that's where we start to really get into what we are learning from history.
Yeah, speaking of what we're learning, in researching and preparing all of this, what is one story that stood out to you? Well, we probably can't limit ourselves to one, but who do you want to shout about from the rooftops so everyone will learn more?
Oh, and this is where I have to choose one and remember that this program is only an hour. I think one of the national stories that really was exceptional for me to learn about was that women in New Jersey could legally vote until 1807, and it wasn't an accidental omission of the word male. The words he or she were included in the New Jersey Constitution in regards to voting. So it was a deliberate inclusion and then deliberately taken away in 1807. And so if you think about, women in New Jersey had this right, and then it was taken away from them, it brings a different level of understanding to how long this movement has been going on. And I just thought that that was such an incredible story. More close to home, one of the most incredible women that I have learned about recently is a woman named Nellie Francis. And Nellie Francis was an African-American woman, and she lived in St. Paul with her husband, and she was an advocate for many things, but definitely suffrage. And she was a founder and president of an African-American women's suffrage club. And she also, after the 19th Amendment was passed, didn't stop moving. And I think that's something important for us to remember, is that women didn't just fight for this one right. They continued. And in the case of Nellie Francis, she helped pass anti-lynching legislation in Minnesota. After the lynching in Duluth of 3 African-American men, Nellie Francis was really the leader in pushing this anti-lynching legislation through the Minnesota legislature, which is just remarkable. And so she's just one of many, but a person that I find really remarkable.
Yeah, and I just want a note for our audience. You all just saw a really great illustration, and that comes to us because of the new exhibit and website. These illustrations you'll be seeing were commissioned for that work. So, so just to note that. But related to the work that Nellie Francis was doing, I just wanted to mention that my two, because I couldn't choose one, are Mabeth Heard Page and Myrtle Cain. So they were two of the first 4 women who were all elected in a single year to the Minnesota House of Representatives in 1922. So just a couple years after the right to vote, we have women in office. And I think that's so cool. They both represented Minneapolis, and Mabeth Heard Page was the only woman left when she retired from office in 1943. So we had a little burst of women getting elected, and then of course a bit of a lull, and then I'm also always reminded of the story of Koya Knutson, who came into office in the 50s. So there was this dearth of women in office for a time. But Myrtle Cain was actually 28 when she was elected and proposed an Equal Rights Amendment in 1923, just a year later. And that stalled in the legislature, but she also authored the first bill targeting the KKK. So she must have been working with Nellie Francis. And this is the first ever bill in the United States. So, and it made it a misdemeanor for Klan members to be masked, to conceal their identities in public. And later, 15 other states passed similar laws. So it's pretty incredible what a few women can do.
Just to add a couple more names, Marie Bottner Baldwin is a Turtle Mountain Band of Ojibwe member, and she was a law clerk, and she was fighting for treaty rights, and eventually went to DC, where she worked for the Office of Indian Affairs there, and she also supported the women's suffrage movement and was an active participant in Native suffrage groups. And so she really speaks to the sort of unique position of Native women, who many of whom were voting in their tribal communities long before the women's suffrage movement took off in the US. So her story, I think, is really fascinating and adds to that complexity of our shared history.
Yeah, and we talked about women of color being left out of the narrative, and what I think is I don't know, just a moment of sadness for me in this is that Native women didn't become citizens until 4 years after women got the vote.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's, I'm sorry, Ami, go ahead. Yeah, I think there's different steps along the way that we need to consider in the 20th century where women of color did not receive the right to vote, or did not get the right to vote for Native women in 1924, for African American women, not until the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which is not that long ago. And so I think those two pieces of legislation in particular show that this is just a continuous struggle.
Yeah, and we have to, think even today, what kind of barriers are we seeing this year? it's very important. This year is a huge election, and how are we promoting access to the ballot? How are we promoting our right to vote and continuing that fight?
Yeah.
Can
You
I?
know, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Sandra.
Well, I was going to move us along. So if you have a comment.
Oh, I just wanted to bring up one more local story, if I could, about South St. Paul. So if you both could back me up here to make sure I get the story right. The 19th Amendment was officially ratified on August 26, 1920. South St. Paul had already scheduled an election, a special election for August 27th, 1920. And so I think it was something about water in the city of South St. Paul. So women in Minnesota and South St. Paul were the first in the nation to cast their ballots.
Yeah, it's such a fun connection. And I think South St. Paul has been shouting that from the rooftops for a year.
Mhm.
Marguerite
Definitely.
Newberg is sort of recognized as the first woman to have voted in the US after the passage of the 19th Amendment. And she gets quoted in the newspapers saying she woke up at 6 a.m. to get in line. She's a good suffragist. She was very excited. So it was a big moment.
That's great. So to move us along, in education, there's a phrase about women in curriculum, simply add women and stir. So Jessica, how does your work respond to that trope?
Yeah, it's it's hugely problematic that women only appear deliberately in a couple of places throughout the curriculum. It's changing. It's really changing, and people are being more inclusive. But there's just this sense that, first of all, that it's this one-dimensional narrative, that there was one fight for one right. And this narrative really presents women as uncomplicated, that when we only encounter women in historical textbooks in the narrative as suffragists or as homemakers, what does that say about women? And it really denies the complexity of this long battle for women's rights, and not just voting rights, for things like the right to get a divorce, and the right to own property, and the right to have custody of their children, which was all a longer part of the struggle. And it also erases the work of thousands of women, in particular women of color, as we've been talking about. But the thing that I think we really need to push back against when we're talking about, just add women and stir, is this beginning point of 1848 and this ending point, this finish line of 1920. It's sort of a celebration, which it should be. 1920, women got the right to vote. The end. And that's just simply not the case. And so I think that we can do better when we're talking to our students, and I think we owe it to our students to show how women have been a part of the fabric of this country, and in particular as they fought for their own rights.
Yeah, and I'm reflecting on that comment about complexity and how, that's not just a women's issue, right? We're seeing it in all kinds of current conversations about, the single narrative that we learn in school. And so I'm curious about how you see that changing in the classroom, because I certainly remember having to memorize dates and events and, show up for the test. And that did not make me love history. So how is your field making that change, Jessica?
Sure. Well, our teachers are incredible, and they want to bring in more of these stories, especially stories that reflect the identities of their students. And so the way that we help teachers create these types of resources is to bring in diverse primary sources. So, for example, if you're going to look at a speech written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, also bring in a piece written by an African American suffragist, to really show the balance, and that these things were happening at the same time. The more we can bring in the actual words of people who were living in that time, the more impactful it is. And so I see that the stories are becoming more inclusive, And the way that we can help then is to support with newspaper articles, journals, government documents, speeches, petitions, that sort of thing, to put them in the hands of teachers who can then put them in the hands of their students.
And Ami, can you speak to kind of the same question? How do you address this in an exhibit where you're going to have folks just walking through at their own pace? Like, how do you make sure that they come away with the big message that you're trying to share?
Well, we've been talking about this so much, especially with this exhibit, which is so. I mean, it's a nice circle, right? We're at the centennial moment. We're in this election year, and there are a lot of parallels. And so, part of what we really want to try to encourage is reflection of the visitor. So, asking them, like, where are you in this moment now? What is influencing you, and where do you see the parallels in this history, and how might that sort of guide you as you're going forward? How might you push back on that? All of these, what we call dialogic questions, that can help spark the curiosity, I think, and also it's a little bit of humility on our part, just showing that we're working from a limited set of resources. The Historical Society has collected a lot, but it doesn't have the whole picture. And so, like Jessica is saying, it's about, saying, when we present one story, what is the other story? What are we missing here? And inviting that openness and that dialogue, I think, is a major goal that we have.
And I think the intentionality of that needs to be really clear. We are intentionally trying to identify the gaps and find the stories. And I think something else we need to consider, especially when we're talking about students, is that nothing in history is inevitable. Students often live very much in their present, and which is good, and we need to be able to find those connections. But I think we can look back at the past and think that something like women's suffrage seems really inevitable. Like, well, of course they were going to get the right to vote because they did. But I think a lot of women's rights at one point were radical before they became acceptable, and then they became inevitable. And so we really have to push back against that narrative of inevitability and say, okay, people struggled for this. Let's ask questions about that struggle.
Yeah, ask questions about that struggle and figure out what the struggle is today, right? Like, I hear a lot of crossover in our three pretty disparate areas of the Historical Society. We're all coming back to that question of historical relevance and why does history matter, and that that cyclical nature that we hear about all the time, that we don't want history repeating itself, but here we are. And so I wonder, Ami, is there more you can say? You mentioned parallels between today and 100 years ago. Is there more you can say on that?
Yeah, well, so a lot of my job was to research these individual women, and looking at their writings, looking at what kinds of things they left behind, finding their names in newspapers. And by doing that, I started to see a lot of patterns, like what they're saying. The words that they're using to describe the moment they're living in is so much like the words I would use to describe the moment I lived through. And what that showed to me was that this is really, it's about that ongoing struggle. It's about that ongoing nature of the work. And it also kind of, I think, helps us see that these women are everywhere, even like you're saying, even if we're not looking for them all the time, even if the curriculums that we're working in don't give us the space or the permission to really investigate all of these rich stories, they're out there. And part of the proof of that is that we're here right now having this conversation. And I think that, I mean, I just got goosebumps. I think that It's like, yeah, these are real people, and as students of history, we seeing real people of the past helps us understand that we're real people too, and we're kind of carrying this forward.
Yeah, we're creating the history of the future, right?
Well, and I think something that I want to jump off of what you were talking about, Ami, about the length and the ongoing nature of this struggle. One thing that I learned in doing research is that of all of the women present at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 New York, only one was still alive when the 19th Amendment was ratified. And so I think about that all the time, especially in the historic moment that we're in now, is that this change takes time, and that so many of these women, because it was hundreds and thousands of women involved in this struggle, and men as well, to secure voting rights for women. And so many of them, including Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and a lot of the big names, didn't live to see it come to pass. And so I think about that when I'm feeling overwhelmed by the issues that I'm really passionate about. It's like I'm one of a long line of sisters going back many, many years, and a long line ahead of me as well.
Yeah. Yeah, you're making me think of, you mentioned the thousands of women, and there was a march in Minneapolis. Do either of you remember who organized that? Now her name is escaping me. Clara Euland.
Clara Euland, yeah. In 1914.
Yeah, so she organized a couple thousand women in Minneapolis, and I just, there's an object in the collection. That's where I live, so I'm going to bring that up. You each have mentioned primary sources, and so primary sources being the sources created in the time, and secondary are reflecting on those primary sources. Did I get that right, Jessica? Sort of close enough.
Yes, that's right.
So I've learned from History Day students, I judge at History Day, and they do a great job of separating those sources. But we have a badge from a suffrage convention in the collection. It's Clara Euland's badge, but the name tag that she wrote in herself says Mrs. Andrew Euland. And it just strikes me as so evident of the time that she's going to a suffrage convention and she's not even writing her own first name. It's just so it's little things like that, little nuggets that's why we love history, right? Like that's what gets us inspired. It's these individual items and these individual stories, these people that are so fascinating. All right, it looks like we have some questions to get into, but I have one more question for you before we launch into audience questions. So how can people discover more about women's history, voting rights, the fight for social justice? What can people do now to advance the struggle?
Well, I always find that understanding the historical context, maybe this is informed by the work I do, but it helps me move through the current struggles. So those big questions that I have about how did we get here, what do we do now, those are questions that can be informed by the past. So MNHS has lots of resources. We have Minipedia, our wonderful free encyclopedia of Minnesota history. And the League of Women Voters has incredible resources of how to get involved in your current elections, how to vote, who to vote, who's on your ballot. And so they're really wonderful. And there's also, I think, so much to learn from each other and so much we can learn alongside each other. So having these kinds of conversations, participating in other ones, like next week, Joan Grow will be speaking, I think, and she's a former Secretary of State and one of my favorites.
Yeah, I'll reiterate your plug for the League of Women Voters because I love their candidate comparison. Every ballot I'm going to fill out, I go to the League's website first because it's so great to see the candidates responding to the same questions, so you can really do that side-by-side comparison.
I would say that it's important to remember that there's always more to the story, especially when we're talking about narratives that have traditionally excluded women or people of color or both. And so I think it's important to learn to identify the gaps and then ask, well, who might know more about this than me? Where can I go to get information? Of course, there's a lot of books and all the great resources that Ami mentioned. There's a lot of information out there. And so how can I find those stories? And then when I think about, with my teacher hat on, my educator hat, I think about how do I make these relevant to students? Because even though students aren't able to vote because they're underage, they're still constituents. They still are affected by the decisions that are made and have been made in the past. I mean, we wear the present, or we wear the past in our present. You know, it's in our bones, it's in our society. And so I think it's important to find the stories that kids are going to find really interesting. And then there's always action to take to be civically engaged, no matter what your situation is. I ran for office, elected office, a couple of years ago because I wanted to get more involved. And frankly, it was terrifying. Um, but it felt really good to get involved. And so there's a lot of ways that you can get involved and become part of this story.
Yeah, and you don't have to get elected, right? Like you can just drive for it, but you can also do something like filling out the census, right?
Yes.
The census is still open for 2020, and that's all about representation.
Can we talk about the census for just 1 second? Because
Let's
the
do.
census is my favorite type of primary source, and I think that they aren't used enough. The stories that come out of the census are so remarkable, and you can even look at the different questions that have been asked since 1790, which is when the first census was done. I mean, for example, in 1930 was the only year they asked if people had a radio, to see what kind of information that people were gathering. And, you know, this being the last time until 2030 that we're going to be able to be counted and put our information into the public record. It's really important. And for our future historians being able to look back, the census records are made public 72 years after they are taken. And it's just a tremendous resource.
Yeah, I use the census regularly. I imagine, you have as well for exhibit research. You know, we also have a lot of genealogy researchers who come into the Gale Family Library, and that's one of the primary locations for information for family history too. So it's just such a rich resource, and so we all need to get in there and tell the government about us so that 72 years from now, uh, we can be looking back. It's fabulous. You know, I've heard that there's a poll worker shortage. So as far as other things people can do, with COVID, a lot of older folks aren't able to do the working at the polls like they have in the past, and so there's a shortage there. So you could sign up for that. Of course, register to vote. We talked about the league and how they can help you get to the right page. I think the Secretary of State website will get you to your registration page. You can sign up for an absentee ballot too. I didn't realize, I don't think if they've decided yet if you need a witness for an absentee ballot in the general election, but you didn't for the primary. In any case, Secretary
Right.
of State.
Yep.
um, and then just, last night, the DNC kicked off and we have a woman as a vice presidential candidate. We had Hillary running in 2016, but a Minnesota connection. Do you remember who ran with Walter Mondale as his VP? They didn't get elected, so it's easier to forget. But very
Geraldine
first,
Ferraro, right?
yes, Geraldine
Yeah.
Ferraro. So she wasn't a Minnesotan, but Walter was, and he picked a woman. So another feather in Minnesota's cap, I think. But any reflections on Kamala Harris as VP running mate, or just where we are now and where we've come from politically?
I think that women are still vastly underrepresented in elected office. And it's growing. I believe that the numbers for the 2018 House of Representatives is the highest that it's ever been. And a number of women have run for president in the past. Victoria Woodhull in the 19th century, Shirley Chisholm in the mid 20th century, but women are underrepresented. And so I'm looking forward to the day when it's not unique to see women in these positions of power or running for elected office.
I think it sort of speaks to what you were saying earlier, Jessica, about how long it takes for us to make these big steps. And, the 19th Amendment is 100 years ago, and it's today that we have a Black woman on the ticket. It's incredible, and it also takes such a long time. So I think that speaks again to this the long haul that we're in it for.
Yeah, it can be so frustrating, and you can feel so stymied in the moment. But if you use that longer historical lens, I think that it doesn't alleviate the frustration by any means, but it does make it easier to understand that it's not our moment that's the one that isn't progressing as fast as we would like it to, right? That's always the case.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I love analogies to try to think about history, and especially when we're talking to students about how to picture the breadth of this. And so one of the analogies I shared with teachers is that if you think about the history of the United States as 1 year, women have had voting rights for 5 months, have been in the Senate for 4 months, and have had major party presidential candidates for 1 week. But they've been fighting for that whole year.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a pretty good opportunity to move into our Q&A. I think we've got one question queued up already, and our team is going to give us another. But from Danielle Dart, what's the most important question we can be asking ourselves about this history as we move toward the 2020 election? Anybody want to take that first?
That's such a great question. Thank you, Danielle. The question I think that keeps coming up to me is like, what's still happening here? Where have we missed a gap, or where are we still seeing a barrier? How can we keep pushing? As long as there has been a ballot, there have been barriers to accessing that ballot. And those barriers are ongoing. Now we're seeing with more mail-in ballots, the access to your mail is becoming more fraught. So, and in many states, including Minnesota, if you have a felony record, you are barred from the ballot. So there are a lot of arenas where we still see the vote being chipped away. And the vote is like our ticket to democratic participation. And it's our right and our duty to keep it and to hold it up for each other. So I would say that's the number one question on my mind.
I was going to say something similar, but you said it very eloquently. And so I guess I would just add, how can I ensure that everybody has access? What am I doing to make sure that everybody has a seat at the table?
Yeah, and you mentioned felonies, and I seem to remember in recent news, I don't know how recent at this point, COVID time, right? But Florida has been making efforts at reversing that, where you can't vote for the rest of your life, was it, if you have a felony conviction? Yeah, do either of you know more about that? That's just off the top of my head.
I know that they passed a bill so that if you had a felony conviction, you no longer were barred from accessing the ballot. It pretty quickly got tied up in some legal, battles. So it's it's one of those things where even if you take one step, there are many more to come.
And that recently happened in Iowa as well, if I recall that. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was part of their constitution to bar felons from voting. And it was just this month, I believe, that the governor signed an executive order to restore voting rights to felons.
Oh, and here we have another question from Clarissa. Was Harriet Godfrey part of the movement supporting women's right to vote? Does that name ring a bell?
I'm not sure who that is.
I haven't heard the name Harriet Godfrey either. I hope this will be a learning moment for me.
Yeah, I was thinking of Gertrude Hunter. That's definitely not the right person. But Ami, I know you know about Gertrude.
Gertrude Hunter, yeah, I can just speak about her. Completely different person.
You have to go to Google and I'll learn later.
Yeah, so Gertrude Hunter was she founded the Working Women's Suffrage Club in Minneapolis and was an advocate for the ballot as a way to allow women to stand up to employers. And her story, I think, kind of speaks to that class issue in the suffrage movement. You had to have time and financial stability in a lot of cases to be able to do suffrage work, to be able to travel around the country and, get into the march in the parades. But there were still working women who were fighting for the ballot too.
Yeah. I wonder, I think this is a good time to plug the website. We're seeing another graphic from the exhibit. And we have a landing page for the Votes for Women exhibit, but there's a hashtag Votes for Women. And that landing page will be populated with more and more information. So you can follow us on social media, and we'll be putting out more and more content about this centennial. So that'll be great to see. Hey, there it is. Thanks. Behind the scenes crew at work.
I just Googled Harriet Godfrey because I had to know who she was. And if it's the same person, it looks like she was the daughter of Ard Godfrey, who was one of the early white residents of Minneapolis. And I think what that question illuminates for me is that there's so much I don't know. There's so much that all of us don't know. So I appreciate that question being asked, because that reminds me that there are always more stories to find. And so I don't know if Harriet Godfrey was involved in the movement, but I'm going to look it up now.
Yeah, and there's, we can all do research, but sometimes the sources just aren't there either. We talked about primary sources earlier, and it got me reflecting on my work as in curatorial, where, we have this vast collection at the Historical Society because we've been collecting for over 150 years. But the vast majority of the artifact collection that I work with really tells a white story in large part until the 70s or so. 60s, we start to see the shift, and I wonder why, right? Civil rights. So it's really interesting to see how history and history museums as a profession, we're still trying to catch up with that multifaceted, intersectional story that we're talking about now. And a lot of our primary source material still revolves around that white narrative. So, Ami, do you have any reflections on how that? Oh, I'll come back to that next question. But any reflections on, how did you work with that when you have limited primary sources telling that wider story when you're looking to represent those stories in an exhibit?
That's a great question, and super important for our field, I think. We have to question all of our sources, and we have to acknowledge the limits, as you're saying, of our resources. And we also can look outside beyond our walls. We have a great very rich community in Minnesota, and of other people, other organizations that we can work with. So with the exhibit, we partnered with the Hallie Q. Brown Community Center and partnered with them to develop some research in some local Black leaders in the 20th century, specifically Josie Johnson and Debbie Montgomery. So that's a little bit later history. But yeah, I mean, what you're saying, I think, is really important, that we have to reckon with our legacy of whiteness in our institution, and be open about that.
And I think that's a really great segue to Nathan's question, which is, does the complexity of Stanton in regards to race still have an effect on feminism today and the relation between Black and white feminists? Who wants to take that?
Well, I'm answering for myself, and as a white woman, I can only comment on what my experience has been, and what I know about the history of this question. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were friends and worked alongside Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists to fight to end slavery in the 1860s, and then fought to extend voting rights. And then when Black men had the right to vote, but women were not included, that really caused a rift in the movement, and it caused Anthony and Stanton to split from Douglass. It caused the Suffrage Association to split in two. And I think that rift probably has really deep roots and is still continuing. And you can see pieces of that rift in the later movement when we're talking about Alice Paul telling Ida B. Wells, who was an extraordinary human being, suffragette, anti-lynching advocate, saying, you're not welcome to march with your state delegation in this suffrage parade because you're Black. And Ida B. Wells did it anyway. But it really, the movement is very much influenced by the rift between those who said votes for women should come before votes for African Americans, and those who said it should be votes for all. And so I think, like I said before, the past is always a part of our present. And so I think it's, from what I see, is still visible today.
I would add also, I think that these are structural issues. These are very systemic issues. Racism is a systemic issue. And so, yes, I think exactly what you're saying, Jessica, these individual people had a huge influence, and their leadership had a huge influence on the movement, and we hold that legacy today. And at the same time, it's not just them. It's, it's in how our country has been built. And we can all do things to help dismantle that, to go so far, and to help reconcile that.
Yeah, and it just comes back to those levels and complexity, right? Where you can see the good intentions of so many people involved in so many issues, and then you see a departure when one group of women within the movement sees that this might be more attainable if we go this route that leaves out this whole other segment of the movement, and that's a really difficult thing to digest, without demonizing the folks who did split, right? Like, so how would you tell this story to a kid in school, Jessica, where like you want to celebrate the achievement, but you need to acknowledge that it wasn't all sunshine and roses?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and teachers grapple with that for multiple parts of American history. And I would tell students that we're complicated. We're complicated beings now, so people were complicated then. And we need to understand as much as we can people's motivation, the context, as Ami was talking about earlier, and the time that they lived in, and that human beings are flawed, but that doesn't mean we can't really take a critical look and appreciate the work that they did, while also taking a critical look and saying, this was a gap. This was a step that had a darker context. So, and kids get it. Kids understand that human beings are complicated and that things are not one-dimensional. And we're doing them a disservice if we tell them that.
Yeah. Well, we have some more questions, so let's move on to the next one. Elizabeth says, how can I find out if my women ancestors were supporters of suffrage? Are there historical records? So we talked about the census, but how would you link that to involvement with suffrage?
One of the resources I have found most useful in my research has been the newspapers, historic newspapers, and they are largely accessible online through MNHS, our website, and if if you search suffrage in there, or if you search for a woman's name, you can start seeing who was involved in what groups, who knew who, and that's been a really useful resource for me in my research and finding out who was a supporter. With our museum closed and with our library closed, it is really hard to get to access a lot of those primary sources, a lot of those records, but the newspapers are largely online, so that can be a nice place to start.
Yeah, and that's through the Gale Family Library's website. And you can keyword search those newspapers, but word of the wise, if you're searching a name, try variations on spelling, because the name might be misspelled in the newspaper, but also we're talking about 100-year-old newspapers. So the technology that has moved that into searchable digital format isn't 100% on getting all those characters correct. So be conscious of that.
I would also link back to what you said, Sandra, about Clara Euland, and in considering the married names of women. So when you're searching, if you know if this woman ancestor was not married, then she might have listed herself with her own first name. But if she was married, she might have listed her husband's first name. So just something to be aware of.
Great. And we've got a few more questions we want to get to. So from Becky, what's the best way to get involved and encourage women to get out the vote? Will the History Center have voter registration available on site at the exhibit? And I think we have a delay in the physical exhibit, so we're going online only. But Ami, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, unfortunately, due to the fallout from COVID, we are pushing the opening of our physical exhibit back, but our online presence will be launched on August 26th. And yep, there's the hashtag Votes for Women. And that will have a lot of resources available for how to get involved. I'll plug the League of Women Voters again. It's a wonderful place, a wonderful resource, and they've got all kinds of strategies for how to recruit your friends and encourage people to get out the vote.
And I'll just add on to that, as you're having your backyard distanced gatherings and you're having your Zoom calls, encourage your friends and neighbors to get out the vote and ask them if they need help. Sometimes signing up for an absentee ballot is not the easiest thing when you're not a digital native, for example. So check in with your friends and neighbors. I think and then the Secretary of State's website, I think, is linked straight through the League of Women Voters. Anything to add there, Jessica, or we can move on? Okay. Wesley, who were the strong women suffragettes from Minnesota? So we've used some names. I'll come back to Clara Euland. because, major organizer there in Minneapolis. But who else comes to mind?
So many. I mean, it was incredible going through this history. It's not just individuals, but they're forming these suffrage groups. There's like probably at least a dozen, maybe 20 or so suffrage groups. And each one of those, you can imagine, has several members, if not a couple hundred members. So, yeah, the suffrage leaders were all over the place, everywhere in Minnesota, metro and outstate. You can find out more on our website, August 26th.
All right. And Renee, I recently realized that my paternal grandmother was a young married woman with children when the amendment passed. Do voter rosters get archived? I'm very curious to know if she ever voted. I am not aware of voter rosters. Do either of you know? I know we have like muster rolls for veterans, so those who signed up for the military, but I don't think voter rosters are a
I
source.
think, yeah, if any have been archived, it's pretty inconsistently. So it's pretty hard. But I think that's a great question for research librarians, or if you have like our librarians at the Gale Fellow Library, or even in public libraries, they'll be super helpful.
Yeah, and I know just a PSA for the Gale Family Library, they are inundated with requests because they've been very short-staffed during the pandemic. They're working their way through, but it might take them some time. So you're welcome to reach out to them, but be patient. All right, and then there's one more question we're going to get to. So from Sue, can you write down your 1-year stats regarding women's suffrage? I am not sure how. Jessica, I see you having a knowing look.
Yeah, I wonder, Sue, if you're referring to when I was talking about if the history of the United States was a year long. I'm not sure if that's what she means, but I can repeat that. It was if the United States history is represented as 1 year. Women have had the right to vote for 5 months of that year, have been in the Senate for 4 months of that year, and have had major party political presidential candidates for 1 week of that year. I love infographics and the way that those they explain complicated things, and students do too. So that's where that came from.
Yeah. All right. Well, any final words? Otherwise, I think we need to start wrapping up so that we get everybody out of here on time. Out of here virtually, right? It's been a pleasure to talk with both of you today. And we actually have a question for everyone watching. So if you know what action you're going to take after this, will you add that in the chat? We'd love to see what you're all considering or committing to, and your action might inspire others here to do the same. I love Gandhi's statement, we need not wait to see what others do. So one final question for our panelists. What action will you take once we sign off? And I'll start. I've already taken the census and registered for my absentee ballot, but I've been meaning to read A Good Time for the Truth, which is a publication from MNHS Press. So will you hold me to this? Will you maybe discuss it with me?
Ooh, is this a book club invitation?
We're starting it now.
Because I have not read A Good Time for the Truth either, Sandra, and so that is on my list. So I think that's another good place to start, because I've also done my census, requested my absentee ballot, and I talk to everybody who will listen, and even people who don't want to listen about voting. So
awesome. All right. And so thank you to everyone watching for joining us and asking great questions. If you're interested in resources from our teacher education staff, please email Heidi at the address on your screen or in the chat. There it is. There we go. And that's the Teacher Ed website as well. And then remember to follow us on social media. We'll be doing the hashtag Votes for Women, the Votes for Women website. We'll be adding more and more content in the coming weeks. And then we mentioned the program we have next week. And we also hope you can join us on Women's Equality Day, Wednesday, August 26th at 7 p.m. That's a conversation with Joan Groh and Lori Sturdivant about voting practices and Minnesota's high voter turnout. We're very proud of ourselves. So join us for that. And a big thank you to the team behind the scenes for keeping us moving, aggregating those questions, and just all the things. So now I've got a book to find, and I hope you'll be getting started on whatever it is that you plan to do. Again, thanks for joining us.